Andy C from Piece of 8-Bit, and welcome to an incredibly warm studio/office. Welcome to this week's main feature. We've been living with the Game Boy throughout the month of August as part of our Month With series. Now, last week we looked at one of the biggest questions surrounding the Game Boy. How did this thing beat the competition? Because alongside the Atari Lynx and Sega Game Gear, well, the Nintendo, well, it looked positively primitive. The competition offered coloured screens, particularly in the case of the Lynx, more impressive hardware. The Game Boy, well, that came with just 4 shades. It didn't have a backlight, it was modest in its processing power, and it had a screen that could get a bit blurry if Mario moved a little bit too quickly. And yet, we know what happened. The Game Boy didn't just beat those machines, it absolutely destroyed them. It became a phenomenon. It sold by the tens of millions in enormous numbers and helped establish Nintendo as the king of handheld gaming, a position that it would effectively hold for decades and frankly all the way up to today. Last week we looked at the practical reasons why that was: battery life, price, portability, games. But there's another question behind all of that. Why did Nintendo even make these decisions in the first place? Why would Nintendo deliberately build a machine using technology that was already looking pretty dated? To understand that, we need to understand the man behind the vision, Gunpei Yokoi. A man who, if you cut him open like a stick of rock, he'd have Nintendo written right through him. And apologies to anyone outside of the UK who doesn't get that analogy, but I think you get the gist. Because Yokoi didn't just help create the Game Boy, he had a philosophy about technology that explains almost everything about why the Game Boy was designed the way it was. And remarkably, you can still see that philosophy alive and well in Nintendo even today. Gunpei Yokoi joined Nintendo in 1965, and this was, as you might imagine, a very different Nintendo from the one we know and love today. The company had been making playing cards since 1889 and had spent years experimenting with ways to diversify into other businesses. Yokoi wasn't recruited as a visionary designer at the time. He was an electrical engineer who graduated and was employed to maintain machinery on Nintendo's production line, which in the end he found pretty boring. So during his downtime, Yokoi began tinkering with bits and pieces around the factory and constructed a simple extended arm using a cross-lattice mechanism, and it allowed you to grab objects from a distance. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi spotted it, and instead of asking why one of his engineers was messing around, instead of doing work, Yamauchi saw something else, a product. Nintendo developed Yokoi's invention into what was called the Ultra Hand, which was released in 1966, and it became a huge success. And suddenly, Yokoi wasn't maintaining manufacturing equipment in Nintendo anymore. He was designing toys. He followed the Ultra Hand with products such as the Ultra Machine, essentially a mechanical pitching machine, and the wonderfully strange Love Tester, which supposedly measured the romantic compatibility between two individuals. And there was something important developing underneath all of these slightly weird, slightly odd Nintendo toys, and that was a design philosophy. Because Yokoi wasn't really inventing revolutionary new technology, he was taking technology and mechanisms that already existed and was asking the question, well, what else can we do with this? And eventually, that philosophy would get itself a name. So I think the phrase that's most closely associated with Gunpei Yokoi is usually translated as the following: lateral thinking with withered technology, which is a term that I absolutely love and one that really resonates with me as an engineer myself. Now, it doesn't exactly sound like the slogan for the next billion-dollar technology company, right? But withered technology doesn't mean it's bad or obsolete technology. What it means is it's mature, it's technology that's already well understood, it's technology that's reliable, and most importantly, well, certainly importantly, it's technology that's cheap to manufacture. So rather than constantly asking the question, well, what's the newest technology available? What's the leading edge, bleeding edge thing? Yokoi's philosophy was essentially, what interesting things can I do with technology that already exists? And there are some enormous advantages to that approach. As we've just said, the components are cheaper, the manufacturing processes are established and well understood, and the limitations of the hardware itself are also well understood. And because you aren't relying on raw technological spectacle, you're forced to concentrate on the stuff that's really important, on the experience, the toy, the game, the fun. And one of the greatest examples apparently came from something Yokoi noticed whilst he was travelling. Now, the story supposedly goes that he saw a businessman on a train absent-mindedly just pressing buttons on a pocket calculator to pass the time. Now, pocket calculators have become relatively inexpensive by this point, and their LCD displays were mature technology. So Yokoi asked a very Yokoi question: well, what else could we do with them? And the answer became the Game & Watch. Beginning with Ball in 1980, Nintendo produced small electronic games using inexpensive LCD technology and contained a game and, as the name suggests, obviously a clock. They were very simple, they were portable, affordable and enormously successful. Now, I love the Game & Watch games, although I would typically have non-branded cheaper versions back in the day off the market. Nevertheless, the DNA was still there and they entertained me for hours. I had actually quite the collection back in the 80s. And Game & Watch would also produce another piece of Yokoi's legacy. For the 1982 Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong, Nintendo needed better directional controls. Now, a joystick would have been far too bulky, so Yokoi's team developed a small cross-shaped controller. Up, down, left, right. Nintendo would subsequently use the design on the Famicom and the NES controller, and variations of it have appeared on almost every games controller since, and we are of course talking about the ubiquitous D-pad, something which is an integral part of gaming controllers even now in 2026. But Game & Watch demonstrated something even more important. Nintendo now knew that people wanted to play games away from the TV. So what if, instead of buying a different machine for every game, well, you could have one portable machine with interchangeable cartridges? You know where I'm going with this. So of course, it's the month with the Game Boy, so you know what I'm going to say. But this machine arrived in Japan in April 1989, and it is of course the Game Boy. And if you wanted to turn Yokoi's philosophy into a physical object, you could hardly find a better example. The Game Boy was not designed to win a specifications battle, as we've discussed before. Its display was monochrome. Its processor was very modest, as we've all discussed in last week's video. Its graphics capabilities were also pretty limited. And when machines such as the Atari Lynx and the Sega Game Gear appeared with their colour screens, the technological differences became even more obvious. Which brings us back directly to last week's video, because the things that made the Game Boy look technologically inferior were also some of the things that made it such a brilliant handheld. That simpler LCD meant dramatically lower power consumption, so 4 AA batteries could provide anything from 15 to 30 hours of play depending on the conditions. Compare that with the handful of hours you might get from 6 batteries in some of the colour screen rivals. The Game Boy was also smaller, it was cheaper, it was more durable and genuinely more portable. Yokoi understood something absolutely fundamental, and that is that a portable console has to be good at the point of being portable. Now that sounds really ridiculously obvious now, but the temptation when building a handheld console is to create a smaller version of a home console. Something which Sega did, or at least they attempted to do with the Game Gear. More power, better graphics, bigger screen, and every one of those things of course comes with a cost. The physical size, the battery consumption, the manufacturing costs, the retail price of the unit. The Game Boy made different compromises because Nintendo understood the context in which the machine would actually be used. You had to be able to basically throw it in a bag. Children needed to be able to drop it on the floor and it not smash into a million pieces. Parents had to be able to afford it. You know, the Lynx was double the price of the Game Boy, for instance. And ultimately, you shouldn't have to replace the batteries halfway through your car journey. And the games then also needed to work on a small monochrome screen. Tetris might be the ultimate demonstration of that. It didn't need spectacular graphics, it didn't need enormous processing power, it was instantly understandable, endlessly replayable, and worked perfectly in short bursts. Nintendo bundling it with the Game Boy was a masterstroke. They did it across much of the world, and it helped the machine escape the idea that video games were purely toys for children, because now we had adults playing Game Boy. People played it on trains, on planes, on lunch breaks, on their holidays. Nintendo then hadn't built the most technologically impressive handheld. It had arguably built the handheld that best understood and encapsulated what handheld gaming actually needed to be. And that distinction would define Nintendo's portable machines for decades, all the way up to today in 2026. But Yokoi's influence on Nintendo extended much further than the Game Boy. He headed Nintendo's Research and Development 1 division, R&D 1, which became responsible for an extraordinary mixture of hardware and software output. Yokoi also worked with a young Shigeru Miyamoto, that name may be familiar to you, helping supervise some of his early work. R&D 1 would be associated with games such as Metroid and Kid Icarus, alongside Nintendo's handheld projects, of course. Yokoi wasn't simply an inventor, he became someone who could recognise good ideas, develop talent and build teams capable of turning those ideas into great products. But there's one machine we can't avoid talking about, and that's this, the Virtual Boy. It was released in 1995 and it used a stereoscopic display to create an illusion of three-dimensional depth. You placed your face against the visor and you would see graphics, red graphics against the black background. It was a really interesting technology. I was fascinated by it in the mid-90s. It was also one of Nintendo's greatest commercial failures, of course. The machine could be uncomfortable to use, it wasn't very portable, it had a tiny software library, and it disappeared pretty much as quickly as it arrived, having never even received the European release. And because Yokoi was so closely associated with it, there's a very neat version of the story which basically says Gunpei Yokoi created the Virtual Boy, it failed, Nintendo pushed him out, that's it. Except the reality is probably a little bit more nuanced and a bit more complicated than that, because Yokoi reportedly had reservations about the technology being released before it was sufficiently developed. Another account suggests his eventual departure wasn't just simply a punishment for the Virtual Boy. Either way, in 1996, after more than 30 years at Nintendo, Gunpei Yokoi left the company and almost immediately he returned to handheld gaming. Yokoi established Koto Laboratory and began working with Bandai on another portable machine, the WonderSwan. A fact I was today years old when I discovered this. And once again, you can see his fingerprints all over it. It was compact, affordable, efficient, and built around long battery life rather than brute force technology. But sadly, Yokoi would never see it released. On the 4th of October 1997, Yokoi was involved in a minor road accident. Now, after getting out of the vehicle, he was struck by another car and he died later that day at just 56 years old. The WonderSwan eventually launched in Japan in 1999, and whilst it never approached the extraordinary success of the Game Boy, it gained a pretty respectable following and represented one final expression of Yokoi's ideas about portable gaming. And this for me is where Gunpei Yokoi's story becomes really interesting, because Yokoi died in 1997, but look at what Nintendo did afterwards. The Game Boy Color, which added colour but remained fundamentally conservative technologically and firmly rooted in its original design philosophy. Then the Game Boy Advance. Then Nintendo faced perhaps its greatest handheld challenger in the shape of Sony's PSP, which arrived with a large widescreen display, considerably more processing power, and the ability to play multimedia from optical discs. Still possibly one of my favourite handhelds, I might add. Nintendo responded with two screens. Where is it? Here it is. Responded with two screens, a touchscreen, a stylus, and relatively modest hardware again in the shape of the Nintendo DS. This is the DS Lite, of course. And Nintendo absolutely dominated yet again. Then look at the home console market. Well, Sony and Microsoft have always been loggerheads, pushing towards better HD graphics and increasingly powerful hardware with the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. Nintendo responded with the Wii, which had less powerful hardware, it had motion controls, and appealed to a radically different audience. And it became a phenomenon again. And then there's the Switch. It couldn't compete with the PlayStation or Xbox in raw processing power. Nintendo didn't even try. Instead, it asked a different question. What if your home console was also your handheld? Again and again, Nintendo has refused to make raw specifications the centre of its strategy. Instead, what it does is it takes that technology, which is already sufficiently mature, and it says, what can we do differently with it? And that is pure Gunpei Yokoi. Not necessarily because every Nintendo engineer is sitting around quoting his design philosophy, but because that philosophy became deeply embedded into Nintendo's DNA. Let's go grab my final thoughts on all of this and this amazing visionary, and wrap up for this week. So all said and done, this is why I think calling Gunpei Yokoi simply the creator of the Game Boy actually massively undersells him. Yes, the Game Boy is his masterpiece, for sure. But look at the wider legacy, right? The Game & Watch, the D-pad, his influence on Nintendo's design and development teams, and above all, a philosophy that says technology should serve an idea rather than becoming the idea itself. Last week we asked why the Game Boy beat technically superior competition. Battery life, price, size, games, they're all part of the answer, of course. But perhaps the deeper answer is Gunpei Yokoi. Because the Game Boy wasn't technologically modest because Nintendo didn't know how to make something better, it was technologically modest by design. Nintendo concentrated his resources on the things that actually matter to someone carrying a games machine around with them, and more than 3 decades later, well, that still feels remarkably modern to me. Because whether it's the Game Boy, the DS, the Nintendo Wii, or the Switch, Nintendo has repeatedly demonstrated that being the most powerful machine in the room doesn't necessarily matter. Sometimes, good enough technology combined with a brilliant idea is far more powerful, and that might just be Gunpei Yokoi's greatest legacy. So there you go. Hope that was interesting for you. I found that absolutely fascinating, digging into Gunpei Yokoi's philosophy and his vision. I think it was absolutely fascinating, and I love reading and looking at a lot of these visionaries, and we talk a lot about people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, but I don't think Gunpei Yokoi gets enough credit, enough recognition. And I'm only to make it my mission this week to do a bit of research myself and appraise myself of this great man, and also then obviously share that with you. So I found it really interesting digging into his life, and it's a shame that it ended so abruptly, like so many of these people's these amazing visionaries' lives do. You know, they're taken before their time. Steve Jobs is another great example of that. But you know, you often find yourself wondering what more there could have been if they'd stuck around for a bit longer. But what we have, you know, we shouldn't be greedy, because what we have is an incredible legacy in the shape of, well, not just the Game Boy as I've talked about, but so many things that Nintendo produced, and you know, defined the gaming industry as we know it today. So there you go. Hope that was interesting for you. So coming up on the channel, we have got the racing challenge, which has probably already gone out by the time I'm recording this, because as always I've left it to the end. I said I wasn't going to. I'd do that every week, did it every time. Next week we're going to have a look at Tetris. I think that's what we're going to have a look at next week in our main feature, and discover why Tetris was such an important game and why it has such an important legacy. So we're going to talk about that, because it was a symbiotic relationship with the Game Boy, of course, having been bundled with it. So I kind of wanted to explore why such a simple game had such a massive impact, and why it is so widely loved. And we'll also be looking, I think I'm going to look at Donkey Kong next week on the Game Boy. So I think Donkey Kong Land, which I've got Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color, which I've played a couple of times, but that is basically the same as the full-blown console version, give or take, which is a game I love. But I've never played Donkey Kong Land, so I'm going to dig it out. It's just come today, actually. I've ordered it, so it has been a bit of a pickup. So I'm going to give it a go, because I've never played it before, and see how that looks in 2026. So a new game for me next week in the bit between. And then yes, we are rapidly pushing on through August, so we haven't got too much. We're over halfway now, so not too many more weeks left, and it won't be too long until I'll tell you what it's been like to live with for a month. I'm actually going away on holiday soon, so I'll be taking it with me, which is why I do tend to play a portable when I've got holidays coming up. So that is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you do enjoy these videos, please do hit that like and subscribe button. Really do appreciate your support. Thank you for all your comments. Please do comment on this video, your memories of the Game Boy, or on any of the bit between videos that I do as well. I'd love to hear all of your memories and thoughts on those games. I don't always get to your comments straight away these days. I've got a lot more comments than I used to, so I have to carve some time out to go and look at them. But yes, I think that is it. So yes, just leaves me to say thanks all for watching. Like I say, hit that like and subscribe button, bell icon for notifications. I said that already, I'll stop repeating myself. Say please do all take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, bye for now.